Hey everyone, this is my second cultural presentation on Germany. For the next few slides, I'm going to be using the same resource, which was written by Tim Lambert at localhistories.org, a timeline and a brief summary. Okay, so in 1815, just after Napoleon was defeated, the Congress of Vienna met to decide the fate of Europe. They made a German confederation in order to replace the old Roman Empire. It was made up of 38 states. Prussia was the biggest winner from this. It gained the Rhineland and Westphalia. The population of Prussia increased and it got more resources. It became more important in German affairs. In the 1830s, Germany began to industrialize. One sign of this was the opening of the first German railway in 1835. As Prussia industrialized, it got stronger while its rival, Austria, remained agricultural and it was growing weaker. And in 1845, there were some bad harvests and a recession, as well as high unemployment. The people were discontent and revolution erupted in 1848. Eventually, in 1849, the European rulers began to use their armies to put down the rebellions, and the old order eventually returned. And Prussia and Austria fought a short war against Denmark in 1864. And as a result of this, Prussia and Austria were given joint administration over the lands in Denmark. But they disagreed over the lands, and it gave Prussia a reason to start a war in 1866. It ended pretty quickly. On July 3rd, 1866, Prussia won against Austria, and a peace treaty created the North German Federation, which was dominated by Prussia. Okay, in 1871, southern Germany reunited with the northern states. The southern German states agreed to become part of a new German empire with the Prussian king as the emperor. William I was proclaimed as the emperor on January 18th, 1871. Otto von Bismarck was the German chancellor, and he was against socialism. In the late 19th century, it was a growing force in Germany. He tried to take down socialism by introducing welfare measures. In 1883, he introduced sickness insurance. In 1884, he introduced accident insurance. And in 1889, he introduced old age pensions. But socialism still kept on growing. And by 1914, the Social Democratic Party was one of the largest ones. Eventually, Bismarck resigned in 1890. Bismarck always wanted to be friendly with Britain, but under his successors it was different. From 1898, Admiral Tirpitz began expanding the German Navy, and Britain was a large naval power and alarmed them. And furthermore, Europe became divided into two different camps, armed camps, with Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, and Britain, France, and Russia on the other. Okay, the spark that started World War I came on June 28, 1914, when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. So in August 1914, the German army overran Belgium and marched on Paris, but they were defeated at the Battle of Marne in September. They started digging trenches, or both sides started digging trenches, and years of deadlock followed. But in the east, Germany had more success. They crushed the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg. But in 1917, Germany introduced unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that ships from any nation coming to trade with the Allies would be sunk. So this caused the U.S. to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. In March 1918, Germany started a series of attacks on the British and French lines, but they failed to break through, and on August 8, 1918, the British counterattacked with tanks. And then in September, the Americans began a counterattack against the Germans. The Allies were advancing, and on September 29, 1918, General Hindenburg advised the government that they couldn't win the war. In 1919, the German government was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. but most of the Germans were opposed against the Treaty of Versailles. They also resented the war guilt clause, which blamed Germany and its allies for causing the war. And under the treaty, Germany lost a lot of its territory and population. It also limited the number of soldiers to 100,000. Germans weren't allowed submarines, battleships, or an air force anymore. They also had to start paying war reparations. In 1930s, a depression began because Wall Street crashed in the USA in around 1929. This was a disaster for Germany. Unemployment was very high in the 1920s already. In about 1928, unemployment was already 8.4%. But it went up at the end of 1929. By 1933, the unemployment rate had risen to 33%. This caused more people to turn to radical parties like Communist or the Nazi Party. And on January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg asked Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. On August 2nd, 1934, President Hindenburg died, and Hitler took over the president's powers and called himself Führer, which means leader. He made the army swear an oath of loyalty to him, and anyone that opposed his regime would be arrested and sent to concentration camp without trial. And then on November 7th, 1938, a Polish Jew named Herschel Greenspan shot a German official at the German embassy in Paris. In response to this, the Germans attacked the Jews and the Jewish property on November 9th, 1938. They attacked Germans' homes and shops, and many windows were broken. It was called Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass, and thousands of Jews were sent to concentration camps. On September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but Poland was soon overrun. On September 17th, the Russians invaded Poland from the east, and by early October, the Polish resistance was crushed. In April 1940, the Germans occupied Denmark and they invaded Norway. They captured Norway in June. In May 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. In 1941, Hitler invaded Russia, which wasn't a very good move. Even worse, on December 11th, 1941, he declared war on the USA. By the end of 1942, the British won the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. In November 1942, the Russian army surrounded the Germans at Stalingrad. Part of the German army there surrendered on January 31st, 1943, and the rest of the army surrendered on the 2nd of February. After this disaster, Germany was losing the war, and British and Americans began bombing to destroy German cities and industry. The German troops in North Africa surrendered in May 1943. Germany was starting to lose the war. By January of 1945, the Russians were ready to invade Germany, and on May 2nd, they captured Berlin. Meanwhile, in late March, the British and the Americans crossed the Rhine. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th in 1945. His tyranny didn't last long after that. The Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, 1945 at 11:01 p.m. After the war, the Russians and the Western powers drifted apart, and it became clear that Germany wasn't going to be reunited. The Russians had stripped East Germany of its resources. The Americans gave aid to Germany and the rest of Western Europe. This aid was called the Marshall Plan, and it was paid from 1948 to 1952. In the 1950s and 60s, Germany went through an economic miracle. The devastation caused by World War II was repaired, and the economy boomed. In 1955, West Germany was allowed to join NATO and rearm. However, in East Germany, things were different. It was called the German Democratic Republic, but it was anything but democratic, and soon a full communist regime had been imposed. In 1953, there was a wave of strikes in East Germany. The Russians responded by sending in tanks and killing lots of civilians. And not surprisingly, this caused a lot of people in East Germany to flee for a better life in the West. In 1961, alarmed at the number of skilled workers that were leaving East Germany, the government built the Berlin Wall, and anyone who tried to leave was shot. The communist tyranny collapsed in 1989, and on November 9th, the Berlin Wall had been opened. After the collapse of communism, Germany was reunited on October 3rd, 1990. Germany then had the task of trying to raise the living standards in the East to the same as those in the West. Nowadays, Germany is a wealthy country with a high standard of living. Then Germany joined the Euro in 1999, and in 2005, Angela Merkel became the first woman Chancellor of Germany, and she's still the Chancellor to this day. German homes. According to Eric Solsten in the Library of Congress, and his book Germany, a Country Study, most Germans live in self-contained apartments or in single-family homes. Single-story and two-story townhouse-like dwellings make up most of the neighborhoods in small towns and cities, and high-rise apartment buildings are common in the larger cities. Most Germans can't be bothered to buy a house, according to Matt Phillips in an article from The Quartz called "Most Germans Don't Buy Their Houses, They Rent." That's because the country's homeownership rate ranks among the lowest in the developed world. It's 43%, and it was 43% in 2013. This is probably mostly due to the cheap rent, and the regulations are pretty favorable to renters. Also, Germany doesn't let homeowners deduct mortgage interest payments from their taxes. Role expectations. Germany had a score of 66 in regards to the masculinity, based on Geert Hofstede's six-dimensional model that compares national culture. In a masculine culture's performance is highly valued, and an early requirement as the school system separates children into different types of schools at the age of 10. People draw a lot of self-esteem from their tasks and live in order to work. They usually show their status by cars, watches, and technical devices. According to GermanWay.com, an article titled "The German School System," compared to the US, German primary and secondary school system is pretty complicated, and sometimes there are as many as 5 different kinds of secondary schools, usually starting at grade 5, and various paths leading to academic higher education, advanced technical training, or a trade. And according to The Local, in an article titled "Germans Staying Married Longer, Divorcing Less," in 2014, 166,200 married couples got divorced, which was less than the year before that, as well as 10 years before that, according to the Federal Statistics Office. Marriages were found to last longer than in previous decades. Those that split up had been together on average nearly 15 years, while couples who separated 20 years ago had stayed together on average 12 years. One factor for why there are fewer divorces in Germany could be that there are fewer couples deciding to get married. And then a study according to Naomi Conrad in an article titled "Germans Not Opposed to Same-Sex Marriage," a study by Germany's anti-discrimination agency earlier this year showed that a majority of Germans support equality in same-sex marriages, but there was still prejudice. And a German study late last year investigated support for legal equality for homosexual marriage. From that study, 83% spoke out in favor of same-sex marriage, and 95% believed it was a good thing that gays and lesbians were legally protected from discrimination. And then according to the Anti-Discrimination Agency study, almost 20% of Germans considered homosexuality to be unnatural. And about 40% of those who took part in the survey said they found it unpleasant to see men or women showing affection for each other in public, for example by kissing. And then according to a Slate article, titled More Young Adults Are Living with Their Parents by Rebecca Schumann. About 71% of German women and 83% of men between ages 18 and 24 live at home. German children aren't required to live at home until they get married. It's also the smarter and cheaper thing to do. They think saving money is practical, which is a pretty big compliment. And if the children don't move out, they're free to stay with their parents until they can afford to live on their own. Okay, safety and security. According to the Germany 2015 Crime and Safety Report, the crime rates are comparable to those in most first world countries, including the US, and a comparative analysis of crime data for the US and Germany revealed that there are only marginal differences. And according to the 2013 BKA police crime statistics, theft and burglary are some of the most common offenses, making up about 40% of all recorded crimes. The most common offenses, in order from most common to least, include shoplifting, stealing from vehicles, stealing bicycles, stealing from offices, workshops, and storage spaces, home burglaries, then theft of non-cash means of payment, and then finally motor vehicle thefts. The leading cause of motor vehicle and pedestrian accidents involving U.S. citizens are driver error and bicyclist hazards. The driver error can be attributed mostly to American tourists that are confused driving in a foreign country. Bicyclists and bicycle traffic are pretty high risk for American motorists and pedestrians. And compared to the speed limits for major roads and highways in the U.S., speed limits in most German cities are pretty low. The average speed limit is about 50 kilometers per hour, or about 30 miles per hour. They dropped to about 30 kilometers per hour in most residential areas and school zones. And this isn't including the Autobahn though, because large parts of it don't even have a speed limit. There are several international terrorist groups in Germany that target U.S. personnel and have a presence in Germany, including Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Jihad Union, and the Congrejao, which was formerly known as the Kurdistan Warriors Party, or the PKK. The large number of official U.S. government personnel in Germany creates a significant potential target for terrorist groups. The Interior Ministry officials estimate that there are over 1,000 residents that can be described as Islamist extremists, some of whom have had advanced terror training in Afghanistan or Pakistan. One example of terrorism is in 2013, a group of Salafist extremists publicly issued death threats against many German politicians, including the Chancellor Angela Merkel. And illegal drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and ecstasy, marijuana, are widely available. The sale and distribution of these and other drugs can usually happen near train station, public parks, and clubs. While most of the drugs-related activity doesn't affect American tourists or business travelers, they should just be aware that Germany has the same type of crimes as just you find in any other major U.S. city. Arrest of U.S. citizens. Anybody that breaks the law in Germany is subject to prosecution under the German legal system. If a person is convicted and sentenced to prison by a German court, it's going to have to be served in a German prison. The German's authority to try foreigners, and including its own citizens, is based upon the principle of sovereignty, which is the right of a nation to make and enforce its laws within its own boundaries. This is slightly different for members of the U.S. military. There's a general waiver by the country of Germany that can waive jurisdiction under the Status of Forces Agreement. But the German public prosecutor can revoke this waiver within a certain period after notification. This isn't done very often. It's usually only in the case of felonies. So most U.S. servicemen and women are almost always tried in a U.S. military court. However, all American civilians in Germany, including people that depend on the military, or just civilian employees, or former servicemen and women, they're under the absolute jurisdiction of German courts. The German legal system has lots of safeguards to ensure that trials are conducted fairly against U.S. citizens. Having a U.S. passport doesn't give the bearer any special rights or privileges or treatment in Germany, in spite of what you might have heard. The U.S. government or its representative, the American consul, can get anyone out of prison. But being arrested doesn't deprive a U.S. citizen from the consul's best efforts to protect the citizen's legal and human rights. When you're arrested, if the prisoner requests that the American consulate be notified, he or she will be visited in jail as soon as possible after being notified. A consular officer will then visit him or her, and if it's an emergency, they can come right away. Prison visits usually enable the American consul to monitor the health and well-being of the prisoners, as well as keep an eye on the status of the legal case. But the consular officers are not attorneys. They can provide the prisoner with a representative list of English-speaking attorneys, but they cannot select an attorney for the prisoners, and they can't give any legal advice. The consular office ensures that the prisoners has adequate legal representation, which is guaranteed by German law. And the consul can also notify the prisoner's family and friends, or relay requests for financial aid or other aid, as long as he or she gives them authorization to, by signing a waiver. Language barriers. According to Andrew Couch from GroundedTraveler.com, most Germans speak English in one form or another, but it can range from a few words to being completely fluent in the language. The use of English, especially in business, is pretty widespread, enough that it's mandatory in school, usually from grade 5. So most Germans under the age of 50 will have taken English in school at one point or another. The difference just depends on how much they practice and how often they come in contact with English speakers. For example, like when an American says, "I only speak a little bit of Spanish," it usually means that they took a year or two in high school a few years ago. Like they can read signs and mostly menus, and they can put together stuttered sentences that may or may not contain a verb, that are usually to the extent of a little bit, but they rarely can hold a conversation with just a little bit. Germans, on the other hand, they usually seem to have a working knowledge when they say they speak a little bit of English. They can speak with some mistakes with verb tenses and not pronounce a few things right, but in general, they can usually make themselves understood in most situations. Sometimes they'll say, like, "I can only speak a little English. Do you want to discuss politics or religion?" Greeting etiquette. According to an article called German Customs and Etiquette by internations.org, most of the first meetings you have in Germany are supposed to be characterized by a great degree of reserve. Germans will treat you politely but not warmly. They might not appreciate you joking around, being witty or ironic. When you meet a German for the first time, their customs require you to be more conservative. You make a direct eye contact with your new acquaintance. You shake their hand briefly, firmly. Use a formal greeting. German customs place a lot of emphasis on addressing them correctly and using their title, especially if you're with a business contact or a person you've never met before, someone older than you, or someone entitled to your respect. Also use the proper title, Mr., Mrs., or Herr or Frau, plus their last name. For example, Herr Dr. Meyer. First names are reserved by German customs for family, friends, and younger people like university students. But if your new acquaintance or neighbor, coworker, or whoever offers to talk to you on a first name basis, it's common courtesy to accept. When you're on the phone, it's better to be formally polite, and you don't want to call them at late at night or early in the morning or during lunch hours from 1 to 3 p.m. when people like to rest, or on a Sunday, which is a day reserved for spending time with family and meeting with friends. And then always remember to say your full name when you answer the phone. When you call someone who's not a close friend, treat them on the other end of the line with formal courtesy, even if it's only like the receptionist offering to forward your call. Gift giving in Germany, according to oneworldglobalgifts.com. In Germany, a small gift is considered polite, especially when you first meet someone. Large gifts are pretty unusual, especially not before you make a deal, because you don't want your intentions to be misinterpreted. Even small, like little souvenir type gifts to thank local staff for their help and hospitality is appreciated but not expected. And it's not a good idea to give large gifts in private. The larger the gift, the more official and public the gift giving should be. Gifts are expected for social events, especially to express your thanks after you've been invited to like a dinner party or at a home. You should avoid giving anything obviously expensive, because this might make the other person feel obligated to pay you back or to your generosity. Some good gifts for the company you're visiting include quality pens or tasteful office items with your company logo. Imported liquors are usually a safe choice too. You should avoid bringing beer as a gift, since most of the finer brands in the world are already produced and widely available there in Germany. You could also bring some wine or excellent vintage wine from your home country, or an imported wine. Some bad gifts to give are red roses, because they're for lovers. Lilies are usually used in funeral, don't get those. And you should include heather in a bouquet, because it's also planted commonly in cemeteries. German view of America, from an article titled "What Do Germans Really Think About American?" published by the Local. The relationships Germans have with Americans is pretty complicated. Some of them admire and some ridicule. These are a few of the quotes, positive and negative, from German writers, artists, or sportsmen about America and its people. This one is from Jürgen Klinsmann, coach of the U.S. World Cup team. He said, "America is a land of extremes. People have every opportunity. There isn't the same degree of certainty we're used to in Europe. America's motto, according to Klinsmann, everything is possible in either direction." Actor Armin Mueller-Stahl, who now lives in LA, has nothing but praise for his new home. He says, "What I love about America is the vastness, the generosity, the friendliness, and despite some exceptions, the tolerance." The Adidas CEO, Herbert Heiner, noted that Americans have a healthier relationship with money than Americans. He says U.S. consumers, as opposed to Germans, are not penny pinchers who want to save enough for doomsday. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer found the same usefulness noted by Gove rather disturbing. He says America has a deficiency which is related to its youth. It sees things too much from its own point of view, and that's because of its youth. And a philosopher, Andreas Tenzer, agreed that Americans overestimate their place in the world. He said, "If you want to understand U.S. foreign policy, imagine a football tournament in which one team's players are never shown a red card." And satirist Volkan Pispers once said, "It would be generous to describe the average state of mind of the Americans as naive." So he doesn't think we're too intelligent. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you for watching.